Let's review financial statements for manufacturers. I think it helps to try to envision an actual manufacturing environment. Well, this is far from an actual manufacturing environment, but here's my cartoon rendition of one. This example is actually designed to also use as examples of indirect and direct costs with respect to different cost objects, and that's why there's all of the S's and W's. The S's represent supervisors and the W's represent workers, and we generally talk about their salaries and other costs here and whether they're direct or indirect. That's not our purpose here, though, right now. Our purpose is just to sort of get an idea of the flow of costs in a manufacturing system. And the flow of costs really follows the flow of goods. That's where the drawing helps out a bit. First of all, in the interest of simplification, let's imagine a really simple manufacturing environment. This area here is the factory. Inside the factory, you have a raw materials room where you store raw materials, and the rest of the factory floor is the production area. This is where the raw materials come out of the raw materials room as they're issued into production. And once they're in this production area, they get converted into the finished product. So in this production area is where you take raw materials used or issued into production, and you add the conversion costs, direct labor, and manufacturing overhead. Once the goods go through the manufacturing process and they're complete, they get wheeled into a different building. Let's imagine the finished goods warehouse as a totally separate building. Once the goods are completed, and as they enter the door of the finished goods warehouse, the costs incurred inside the finished goods warehouse are no longer considered manufacturing costs. They're no longer product costs. Costs incurred inside the finished goods warehouse are considered to be distribution costs. They would be selling costs. And finally, once the goods are sold, they leave the finished goods warehouse. They're no longer in inventory at all. The cost of the goods that get sold are now an expense, and they're going to show up on the income statement. Hopefully you've printed out the page with the examples of the two different layouts of the financial statements. For now, look at the Plastico example that's labeled Inventory Flow Approach to Cost of Goods Manufactured. And you're actually seeing cost of goods manufactured and cost of goods sold on that sheet of paper. The first section of this approach of computing cost of goods manufactured and cost of goods sold really flows through the raw materials inventory. So it summarizes really what's happening in this room right here. You start off with your beginning balance in raw materials, you add everything purchased, and then of course during the accounting period, goods are moved out of the raw materials room and onto the production floor. Raw materials get used. In this example, chemicals that go into making plastic pellets get wheeled out of the raw materials room, and then they're called direct materials. Once they're issued into production, they get thrown into this pellet machine. And this company produces a couple of different products. So once you have the plastic pellets, they get wheeled into the molding department, and in the molding department, some of those plastic pellets get made into jump ropes. Some of those plastic pellets get made into frisbees or flying discs. And you can see here evidence of my limited drawing ability. Hopefully you can recognize the difference between the jump ropes and the flying discs. From there, the two products separately move into assembly areas. For the jump ropes, handles get added, and so those get issued out of the raw materials room as well. For the frisbees or the flying discs, labels are added and they get cleaned, and perhaps the cost of the adhesive or glue used to attach those labels would be an example of an indirect materials cost. We have direct labor costs being added all along the way, the cost of the touch labor. We also obviously have indirect labor costs being incurred on the production floor because these departments have supervisors who are presumably supervising the activities and not actually assembling or touching the products. The products then get moved into a packaging area. At that point, they're considered complete, and they get moved into the finished goods warehouse. The cost of the goods leaving the production floor, the cost of all the goods completed during this accounting period, is what is called cost of goods manufactured. Cost of goods manufactured, the cost of completed goods, gets added to the costs in the finished goods warehouse. So back to the production floor. Here on the production floor, at the beginning of the accounting period, there's going to be a beginning inventory in unfinished jump ropes and frisbees. Those are your beginning costs in this area. To those costs, you're going to add the cost of all the raw materials issued into production during this period, the cost of direct labor and manufacturing overhead incurred during this period. Then you're going to subtract the cost of all the goods finished and wheeled into the finished goods warehouse, and what's going to be left on the factory floor is the cost of ending work in process, or the cost of partially completed inventory at the end of the year. In the finished goods warehouse, you'll start off with the beginning inventory. What's being added in is cost of goods manufactured. What's being subtracted out is the cost of goods that are sold to customers, and you'll have some ending inventory balance in the finished goods warehouse. So if you use this little cartoon representation, there's basically two inventory flows that go into the computation of cost of goods manufactured. The flow of raw materials to get to direct materials used, and the flow of work in process to get to cost of goods manufactured. Then you flow the finished goods inventory to get to cost of goods sold, the expense item on the income statement. Now let's take a look at the actual computation in statement form. And all I really want to do here is have you compare these two formats that I've given you. The first format on the side of the page labeled Inventory Flow Approach to Cost of Goods Manufactured. Here you see separately the flow of the raw materials inventory. Bottom line of that schedule is direct materials used. The flow of the work in process inventory. Bottom line of that schedule is cost of goods manufactured. And finally, the flow of the finished goods inventory. Bottom line of that schedule is cost of goods sold. Notice that all three inventories follow this generic format down here. There's some beginning balance in inventory, there's some inputs during the accounting period. If you subtract the ending balance in inventory, that gives you the dollar amount cost of what got moved from one inventory account to another, or what got moved from finished goods inventory into cost of goods sold. But they all follow this generic format. In particular, notice that direct materials used becomes one component of total manufacturing costs and moves down to this schedule. Work in process, remember, represents flow of goods in the production area. So there's some beginning balance in incomplete items, and you add the three manufacturing components: direct materials, direct labor, and overhead. Usually you'll see some detail of overhead. Now let's switch gears and look at the statement approach. What I want you to realize there is you're going to get the same numbers for direct materials used, cost of goods manufactured, and cost of goods sold. This is just a more formal, standardized format that you're more likely to see in actual financial statements. Alright, so here's the statement approach. The first schedule here is the schedule of cost of goods manufactured. And notice that this schedule really just combines two of our inventory flow schedules. It combines the raw material schedule with a slightly different order of the work in process schedule. The big difference here is that you come down to direct materials used, and at that point you add in the other two manufacturing costs, labor and overhead. Then you add beginning work in process inventory and subtract ending work in process inventory to get cost of goods manufactured. So it's combining two schedules, and you're just putting the beginning, balance, and work in process in a different place. You get the same answers. I don't care whether you do the schedule in this format or whether you separately do a raw materials inventory flow to get direct materials used and a work in process inventory flow to get cost of goods manufactured. I think the inventory flow approach is a little bit cleaner and simpler. The bottom part of this is an income statement, and this is a little bit different than what was on the other schedule only because there's more information here. In the middle of the income statement, we have a computation of cost of goods sold. Sometimes you see this whole statement put on the income statement. Oftentimes you only see the single line item, cost of goods sold, and this detail is not presented. Here we have the whole cost of goods sold section inside of the income statement. And to finish off the income statement, we're going to take sales minus cost of goods sold. And that gives us, by definition, gross margin. And then below gross margin is where we're deducting all of the other costs incurred during the period for this company. So this is where the period costs are being deducted. Product costs attached to goods that were sold are called cost of goods sold. Period costs incurred during the period get deducted below gross margin as selling and admin costs. Bottom line is net income.